Okay, so welcome everybody. A quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Awabagal people of the land in which the Callaghan campus resides and where we in the room are located today. Our speaker today, Ángel Alcalde, apologies, holds a PhD in History and Civilization from the European University Institute in Florence and is lecturer in 20th century European history at Melbourne University. His areas of expertise are international, transnational and global history, the history of fascism and the social and cultural history of war in the 20th century with a focus on war veterans. His latest monograph, War Veterans and Fascism in Interwar Europe, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, and his paper today is titled Spain, 1936, Decisions for Genocide. Over to you, Ángel.
Thank you very much, Cesar, for this presentation, and thanks also for hosting me and inviting me to come, also to Philip and to everyone for attending, also those people online and those who might be watching the recording. This presentation introduces the conclusions of a research article that is going to be published soon in September in the Journal of Modern History. And it's, well, this research belongs to a broader project on perpetrators of Francoist violence in the Spanish Civil War and Francoist repression. So today I will first introduce some general ideas about the context of the Civil War and Francoist repression and the debates mainly in Spanish historiography about the origins of this violence. And then I will go through an analysis of the origins of Francoist repression. I don't want to assume that all listeners will be very familiar with the topic. So I try to contextualize broadly. If you have any question or you want to ask anything during my talk, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt. I'm fine with that. Okay, so let's start with a bit of background about Francoist repression before examining different aspects of the origins of Francoist repression. This is what we are going to see today. The Spanish Civil War, 1936-1939, was a big struggle between fascism and anti-fascism. This is how broadly the Spanish Civil War has been contextualized. And in recent years, the Spanish historiography and international historiography has looked at this war in a broader European context. So usually, traditionally, the roots of the violence of the conflict was seen as something emerging from Spanish history itself, and well, there were usually references to the tradition of authoritarianism. In the 1920s, there is already an authoritarian dictatorship in Spain under Miguel Primo de Rivera that is partially inspired by the model of Mussolini. Primo de Rivera's son, José Antonio Primo de Rivera will be the leader in the 1930s of the Spanish fascist party Falange. Also the brief war experience, the experience of the colonial war in Morocco in the 1920s, also had an enormous influence in the developments in the 1930s. So we will see now that many leaders, many officers, military officers of the Spanish army in Morocco, the so-called Africanistas, because they were developing their military careers in Africa, were crucial actors in the origins of, not only the coup d'etat of 1936, leading to the Spanish Civil War, but also we will see they were instrumental in creating the context of Francoist repression which can be seen as an exterminatory project. Of course, there are other elements that we need to consider. In general, the rise of fascist regimes in Europe, to understand also why there was such an outbreak of violence in 1936 Spain. The origins of the Spanish Civil War lie in the coup d'etat of 19 July 1936 by a group of military officers, conservatives, in collaboration with fascists. There were this group of Africanist military officers, including Franco, but other people like Mola, etc., who, well, they organized, they conspired during many months, and there was a long tradition of military interventionism in Spanish politics, but it was this group that managed to organize an insurrection, a coup d'etat and an insurrection in July 1936. That is the key cause of the Spanish Civil War. It will be the failure of that coup d'etat in seizing power completely what will open that context for violence, revolution, and a civil war. So in this context of civil war, well, there were tens of thousands of victims of violence in both sides of the Spanish Civil War. I will focus here on the violence in the Francoist side, because that violence has sometimes investigated as a genocide, although most historians in Spanish historiography tend to speak about political cleansing or other terms. My objective here is not to make the case that that Francoist repression should be conceptualized as genocide. I'm not interested in that conceptual debate, but rather what I'm trying to do is to use perspectives of Holocaust and genocide studies, methodologies, research questions of that field to investigate the origins of Francoist repression. Usually, well, many historians in Spanish historiography have argued that there was a plan of extermination by the leaders of the coup d'etat of July 1936 that was then implemented in the early months of the Civil War and also later during the war and during the Francoist dictatorship. The number of victims who died because of Francoist repression has been estimated in around, well, the latest estimates say 140,000 victims. And historians usually have differentiated two different phases in the process. One referred to usually as terror caliente or hot terror, and a second one called cold terror or terror frío. And that refers to first this phase where violence seems to be more well, disorganized, spontaneous, from below, and usually based on actions like so-called paseos, strolls, where members of the rebels, usually members of Falange, so militia, paramilitaries, will go and find leftist leaders of every town or village, take them out of their houses, bring them to the outskirts of the town and shoot them. Usually these victims were left, their bodies will be left there in public. And so this has inspired this notion of hot violence. A second phase will start in early 1937, and in this phase of Francoist repression, the methods changed. And the rebels will use mostly military trials, court-martials that will massively lead to also tens of thousands of executions. So the outcome will be still numerous deaths. But these methods are, these two phases seem quite different. During the first phase of repression, during this phase of the first months of the civil war, the rebels also killed civilians and leftists through another method that is usually called sacas. Sacas, or pullouts, that's what it means, sacar, will consist on taking out prisoners from detention centers and prisons in groups, in bigger groups, perhaps, well, maybe 5%, 10%, but sometimes even 20, 40, even 100 people will be taken out of prisons and then systematically executed, usually being thrown in mass graves. That's why there are such a huge number of mass graves in Spain that have been unearthed and excavated in recent times. There's a lot of research on this. In this image, for example, one can observe even the posture of the victims. If you maybe you can see with the mouse, this victim here has, well, usually a shot in the back of the head, and his hands are tied behind his back. So that demonstrates that systematicity in the killing. So in this graph, we can observe more or less those two phases in repression. This is the graph showing the accumulative number of deaths provoked by Francoist repression in a single region in Galicia, which is very well investigated. And what is in dark blue, that will correspond to the phase of hot terror or terror caliente, where the intensity of the killing is extreme. Very quickly, there is this extermination of the enemy. Later, the curve bends and gets flatter, but still the pace of the killing continues through military trials. Also, many people died in concentration camps, prisons, etc. But in general, this separation is clear between the phases. Here, in the case of Badajoz, it's even more clear. This is the southwest of Spain, a region through which, at the beginning of the war, the Francoist troops were advancing quickly, trying to seize Madrid. So we can see how the period of hot terror concentrates most killings, thousands of killings, and later it's kind of almost stops after some point at the end of 1936. Then continuing the killings, there are some spikes, but these are usually the two phases. But in general, the whole process of killing is attributed to that plan of extermination, plan de exterminio in Spanish, which, historians have never been able to find any documents detailing such a plan, but there are some documents that point at that intention to use extreme violence, and usually it's the instructions of the coordinator or director of the conspiracy, General Mola, instructions that he wrote months before the war, during April to June 1936, and that he sent to his fellow conspirators in the army, a group of generals and military officers. These instructions already said that action of the coup d'etat must be violent in the extreme to subdue the enemy as quickly as possible, and that all leaders of political parties, societies, trade unions of the left, of the Popular Front that at the time was in power, had to be incarcerated. And well, we see here this euphemistic language to refer to killing, harsh measures, exemplary punishment applied against such individuals. Now, well, this is what usually historians have cited to explain what's the origin of that extermination and that massive killing that happens in the months after the coup d'etat. Now, well, there are different perspectives also in Spanish historiography about the decision-making process behind that program of repression, which is what I'm interested in. I differentiate two main positions. First, what I call the intentionalists, taking here concepts from Holocaust studies, will be people like Paco Espinosa, for example, who says that the whole repression was decided from above and that everything was extremely controlled by the highest rebel authorities, that is, people like Franco, and we will see some others, Mola, Queipo de Llano. However, there are other historians who have emphasized that, well, there was no such decision from a single origin, and there was no common command in the whole of the territory controlled by the rebels about the political cleansing taking place. Some people argue that it was just, well, forces from below, well, the tradition of paramilitary violence, of the requetés, the traditionalist militias, or the fascists who were roaming around killing people in a more spontaneous way. Okay, investigating the origin of Francoist repression and the decision-making process is extremely difficult because of the lack of documents, and also because Spanish historiography on Francoist repression has been usually very regionalized. Now, I have, in this research, I have investigated this a bit deeper with these kind of questions taken from Holocaust and genocide studies. There's a huge debate traditionally on the origins of the final solution of the Nazis. Also, this kind of investigation has been conducted to understand the origins of the Armenian genocide, looking very carefully, like Taner Aksam has done, into Ottoman state documents to see who decided, when decided to carry out the extermination of Armenians, and how these orders were circulated secretly. And there are other cases that have been investigated. So I have paid a lot of attention to the communication means between the leaders of the rebels, and I have looked at the effects that we can observe through other sources to try to understand what the leaders of the rebels were thinking and were planning to do. And what I come to conclude, as you will see, is that there was no such plan of extermination before the coup d'etat of July 1936. There will be rather a decision to implement a program of physical extermination that can be called genocide. Once the leaders of the rebels decided to escalate the coup d'etat into a civil war, and I analyze here the context. So these are the main actors. You will see that not only Franco, but also Mola and General Gonzalo Queipo de Llano are the main important decision makers of the origin of Francoist repression. Of course, retrospectively, this is not surprising. There was already, well, we knew that these, particularly Mola and Queipo de Llano, had a lot of power to decide about the deaths of the members of the Spanish political left during the war. But what I show here is how they reached that agreement and made a common policy of extermination during the war. But at the beginning, that was far from clear. At the beginning, during the conspiration leading to the coup d'etat, Mola was just the director. He was a coordinator. He organized the conspiracy and the coup d'etat, but the project of the rebels was to create a military dictatorship under General José Sanjurjo, who at that time was exiled in Portugal because he had already tried to give a coup d'etat in 1932. Now, there were other members of the conspiracy. Franco was just one member. Queipo de Llano was another, and there were a number of other military officers, generals who agreed to participate in the coup d'etat. So here, this is the plan that the rebels had for a successful coup d'etat in 1936, July. The coup d'etat starts in Morocco on 17th, and over the next 2 days, in the different Spanish regions, the military headquarters, the military officers start an insurrection. The plan was Mola was based here in Pamplona, in the north. The plan was to organize columns of volunteers, civilian volunteers, with a few members of the army to go towards Madrid. Mola expected that the coup will fail in Madrid because there was a strong working class movement there. And crucial for this project was that troops from the African army, so from the colonial army in Morocco, should cross the Straits of Gibraltar and then advance towards Madrid. The troops in Morocco were the elite troops that were the strongest troops of the Spanish army at the time, led by people like Franco, etc. Okay, all these people have had experience in the colonial war, but at the beginning of this coup d'etat, this is the situation. So the coup failed in a few regions, in Madrid, in Valencia, in Barcelona it fails, and some of the conspirators also lose their life. For example, Godet, who flies from Palma de Mallorca to Barcelona during the coup, he is captured and then he will be killed. And it happens that Sanjurjo takes a plane to go to Burgos, which is going to be the capital of the rebels in the north, and the plane crashes and he dies. So that opened a strange situation where the rebels had no project, no clear idea of what to do. The coup had failed in important regions of Spain, particularly in Madrid. Sanjurjo had died. So what they do is to get together in the north and form a junta. And they give the chief role in the junta to Cabanellas here on the right, who is actually a Republican and a Mason. So my argument is that they choose to give that role to Cabanellas because they feel they are going to fail in their objective and they might have to negotiate with the Republic. Okay, eventually the situation by 23 July is far from clear for the rebels. Particularly the situation is complex in the south. Queipo de Llano has managed to succeed, usurping power, military power in Sevilla in the south, but all the southern region is in the hands of the Republic, and there is a revolutionary situation where working class parties and trade unions have weapons and are actively fighting against the coup. So in red you see the region dominated by, well, under the Republic nominally, but under the factual influence of revolutionary forces of the left, while in blue is what is dominated by the rebels. Now, it's interesting to see that, despite what is usually argued, that the rebels started that exterminatory violence right with the coup d'etat. There is a period of time in the few days after the coup where there are not that many killings. There is not a clear systematic use of violence to exterminate the enemy. Now, things start to change, and I argue that there is a process of escalation in repressive policy. And I argue that this happens first in the south, where Queipo de Llano was trying to make the plan work at all costs. The rebels had the idea of, okay, we need to use violence to subdue the resistors until they stop their strikes, their resistance, and then we impose that dictatorial regime. Now, this doesn't work anymore after a few days because they find much more resistance than they expected. So their repressive policy, which is initially used to facilitate the seizure of power, doesn't work. Now there's another problem in the south, and that is that the Spanish Navy will be mostly controlled by the Republic, because whereas naval officers joined the rebellion, the sailors did not. And many sailors killed the naval officers and maintained the ships in the side of the Republic. So that disrupted the plan of bringing elite troops from Morocco to the peninsula. And so they cannot advance towards Madrid, the best troops that the rebels had. So that happens around 23, 24, 25 July. What are they doing, the rebels? They are in two regions. In the north, in Burgos, there is this Junta de Defensa Nacional, and Mola is only, he is appointed Chief of Army North, so controlling the rebel troops in the north. Franco will be appointed Chief of the Southern Army and the Moroccan Army, while Queipo de Llano is trying to assert rebel power using violence in the south. And it is in Sevilla and in the south where Queipo de Llano starts to change the policy of the rebels, with taking increasingly radical decisions about how to act against all those who are resisting. And as soon as 23rd July, he says on public radio, he broadcasts that he's authorizing under his responsibility to kill like a dog anyone who is resisting. At the same time, he's starting to receive, well, but the rebels have some plane that they can use to send people from Morocco, these elite troops, but they are arriving very slowly. Queipo needs these troops to, break resistance of the working class in Seville, in this kind of violent actions that leave people murdered in the streets. That's why the first massacres happen with this objective of the rebels of breaking resistance. And Queipo de Llano is giving these bandos on radio that later became very well infamous. And here we can see this photograph of July 1936 in Seville. A few of these colonial troops from Morocco who are arriving amidst acclamation of supporters of the rebels. And these troops will be systematically used gradually in the south to reconquer or to conquer, to occupy all those towns that are in the hands of the left. That's a context that I call of degenerate war. This is another concept that I bring from genocide studies. And in this context of degenerate war, it's interesting to see how the rebels continue transforming the repressive policy, escalating that repressive policy, inspired also by the practices of violence, of the degenerate war that these military officers from Morocco are bringing. For example, the Major Castejon of the Spanish Foreign Legion, he was in charge of what they call pacifying the south. He will take a column of legionnaires and regulares, the colonial troops, to go village after village, town after town, with extreme violence, exterminating all resistance that he found. Those are the first massacres. But at the same time, we see other process that is happening within the city, in Sevilla, where Capo de Llano appoints this captain, Manuel Díaz Criado, delegate of public order. And this guy is going to start using other methods to systematically kill, without any trial whatsoever, people that had been arrested by the rebels in Sevilla. Very quickly, all the prisons and detention centers of Seville were full of people, full of left-wing people, and they had not resisted. They were arrested because the rebels had information about who these people were, but they will be systematically taken out of prisons and murder. That starts to happen around 25 July and will continue later. This is another example of these rebel troops entering towns and taking prisoners, members of trade unions, and then taking them. So there's legionnaire troops taking them out of to the outskirts of the towns and being systematically killed. Well, this is the location of that massacre. That it was, by exception, there are photographs of this. This is another example of Llerena in Extremadura of how these massacres took place. And these are some of the effects. They left the victims usually in public. But that contrasts with the systematic practice of occultation of the massacres that we will see happening later. And I argue that that corresponds to a change in policy. In fact, I argue that a conscious decision to apply a more refined method of political extermination was decided on by the rebels between 28th and 31st July 1936. And this decision was made by Franco, Mola, and Capo de Llano, communicating between themselves through different means. I have found out that they not only, they communicated by radiogram, they communicated also by sending each other letters sent by plane, personally delivered. And at some point they were able to establish direct communication by wire. But at the beginning, this is a difficult process of communication that left few traces in documents. But examining all these traces, I have arrived at the argument that the key decisions happened. The first one happens on 28 July. And this is only when the rebels know that the fascist powers, Italy and Germany, are giving them military aid to win the war that is starting. That's key in the decision of escalating repressive policy. In particular, it is on 27 July when Franco, who was in Morocco, is informed by some emissaries they had sent to Germany, to Nazi Germany, that Hitler was going to support the rebels. In fact, we know with this interview between Franco and journalist Jay Allen on 27 July, that Franco is becoming euphoric, and he's arguing that, okay, if I need, I will shoot half of Spain to save the country. And he's saying that because he has just heard by a telegram that Hitler has decided to send planes to help the rebels transport those troops from the south, from Morocco, to the peninsula. Immediately, one can see how Franco starts being appointed to new positions of power within this amorphous, somehow rebel coalition. So, after that interview with Jay Allen, Franco takes a plane and goes to Seville. And there, he had a meeting with Capo de Llano and some other generals, where he disclosed, obviously, that he had Hitler's support to have planes. One can see there that repressive policy escalates already in the south. And it's possible to trace a bit how this news also reached Mola in the north. Eventually, the first plane sent by Hitler, these Junkers that were able to transport troops, they arrived to Morocco, to Franco, on 29 July. Immediately, Franco sends a radiogram, this is handwritten by Franco, on 29 July saying, okay, the first transport arrived today. He's referring to the Nazis' aircraft. Up to 20 shall arrive. In fact, we know that up to 20 first planes sent by the Nazis arrived to Franco. Also, firefighters, I will get anti-aerial machine guns, and he concludes, somos los amos, we are the masters. That's an euphoric message to Mola in the north. Mola was almost considering to withdraw their troops, but in Burgos, the people there received this message and they enter this state of euphoria that leads to radicalized repressive policy. They believed they were going to win the war thanks to that support. They were going to win the war in a few weeks' time, they believed, and therefore they saw the chance to have a context to wipe out all resistance beyond any legal consideration, without conducting military trials that are always slow, they take a lot of resources, time, etc. So they published this Bando de Guerra, which is published on 30 July, even though it had been written on the 28th. That will give pseudo-legally the possibility of just applying an extremely harsh repressive policy. The rebels could kill just for verbal dissent. And in fact, later we know that, well, the rebels just had to decide first who they wanted to kill, and then they say, you need to apply the Bando de Guerra, so this is like a war edict, to kill that person, without any other legal consideration. This is the Bando de Guerra, it's justified. We see also, 31st July, instructions given by Capo de Llano to advancing columns of troops throughout Extremadura that say energy in repression shall be extreme. Bando, the Bando de Guerra, this war edict, shall be applied, that means killing, to all Popular Front leaders and affiliates who are found with arms. But later, even if Popular Front members were not found with arms or resisting whatsoever, they will be murdered. through sakas. Now, after these decisions, we can see that by 1st and 2nd August, in many different parts of the territory controlled by the rebels, there are already massive massacres, taking out numerous prisoners, left-wing prisoners from detention centers, and killed. And this is an example of what we can see in other documents. These documents are just reports by doctors or other authorities when they found a body, a corpse. And they always, well, they didn't know the name of the person who they had found dead, but they always noted how that person had been killed. And we read fractura cráneo por arma de fuego means, well, the back of the neck is broken by a gunshot. And in the same day, 1st August 1936, in Zaragoza, is this case, we find like 20 of those killings happening. And this was not happening before. This practice will continue, escalating more and more. Here, by the way, this is another evidence, documentary evidence that something had changed among the rebels around the 2nd of August. These were, documents, actas. These are just, some sort of memorandum that legally the members of the Junta de Defensa are approving of death sentences. At the beginning, they had thought, okay, we can follow legal considerations, legal procedures, trials to then sentence to death resistors. And at the beginning, they were doing this kind of thing. But after 2 August, the members of the junta never again met to sign up those documents because they knew that it was pointless. They were killing people without any legal procedure at all. The rest of August, we see that extension of that system of systematic killing throughout all the territory controlled by the rebels. And we see these systematic sakas happening in many different areas of the territory. They were, and this is something that I do also in the article, I won't discuss in detail, but one can follow how they communicated that new policy that happened mainly orally, sometimes with direct visits by Cabo de Llano, for example, to commanders in the different cities and towns, and then they were told that they needed to escalate the killing through that method of systematic taking out prisoners from detention centers and murdering them. And in fact, we can see how in the statistics of killing, we see how the killing takes up around the end of July, early August. That happens, for example, in this is Rioja, another region, and in Galicia. If we look more closely from this first graph to this more detailed graph of the summer of 1936, we see that the pace of the killing intensifies around early August 1936, I argue, because it's then when they are informed of that exterminatory policy. And I argue that rather than that's just two phases in the overall history of Francoist repression, hot terror and cold terror, there were three phases. First, a phase where the rebels just tried to kill people to make the coup succeed. So allowing fascists and civilian volunteers to go grab a few people and kill them in the street. But that doesn't work after some time. Then they developed this idea of systematically exterminating the people, all the people they could grab, and they considered worth of killing, including, well, people who had not resisted, women, very young people, very old people, anyone who represented that enemy. I argue that the context for that decision and that policy was one of euphoria, confidence in victory, because of the support of the fascist powers to win the war. And they wanted to take advantage of that window of opportunity before the war will end with the seizure of Madrid that they expected will happen rather soon. It didn't happen, but to take advantage of that war situation, that bando de guerra. Now, when they fail to conquer Madrid, that's why they stopped the policy. Apply military trials, court-martials, etc. That, again, makes the intensity of the killing a bit slower. I have other findings that I also comment in this article. It's interesting to see that how the support of the Catholic Church given to the rebels also coincides with this escalation of the repressive policy, and that there were no clear established limits or goals of physical repression, which led first to the rebel leaders insisting once and again to people that they had to kill more, and also to the exclusion from power of those rebel leaders who were not keen to apply this radical policy. Those are my main conclusions of this article and presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to comments, questions, and debate if you are keen. Thank you.
Really interesting. I throw open the room to questions.
I've got lots of questions. So some of these are more questions of detail, like who the perpetrators are. When you talk about indigenous troops and the Foreign Legion, who's actually doing the killing at the beginning? Are they foreign troops or are they Spanish military or militia or fascist civilians or a combination of all of these things?
Well, a combination. The actions to support the success of the coup at the beginning, that's the rebels give like free rein to members of Falange, the fascist party, to just do whatever they want, and they tolerate those things. Sometimes they do in collusion with the Guardia Civil, the military police, and and requetes also in the north. But the elite troops from Morocco, when they start arriving, they are much more extreme in using violence. They have the means, they have the knowledge, they are professionals of that. They are usually, well, members, those who do the killing are, well, legionnaires. They were Spanish, they were foreign legionnaires, quite a lot. The regulares were Moroccans, on 19 July, I remember a document written by a French diplomat near Gibraltar saying the regulares just arrived and made a massacre. They killed women and children, and this is already 19 July because they come with these instructions that they need to make the coup succeed. Now, all these soldiers are under the orders of Spanish colonial officers, Castellón, higher-ranking generals, also Varela, Yagüe. Yagüe is also very well-known because of his, he was responsible of the massacre in Badajoz in mid-August. That is massive massacre against the civilians there. So yeah, we can find a bit a combination of everything.
So may I follow up? So this sort of leads to the big question around genocide and Holocaust studies, and that's questions around motivation and what's driving these people to do it, and the role of ideology in the killing process. So what do you think that what are your views about motives and the role of ideology in this particular form of killing?
Well, ideology mattered. Of course, the ideology of the main decision makers was crucial, but it's also difficult to determine their political ideology. It was this culture, military culture of Africanism, these experiences of the colonial war that were extremely brutal, which also led to people like Mola to see Spanish civilians of left-wing parties or trade unions as similar to the Moroccan ethnic groups that they have fought against in the colonial war. So one can see the language they employ is similar. So motivation here is a bit easier to be a bit more specific, because Spanish historiography haven't, well, beyond the fact that, okay, they are inspired by this Africanist ideology, but also the model of fascist regimes that they admired. The motivation, I see the key motivation to escalate that policy as a strategic logic. It's a logic of military strategy, well, one can connect with these debates about how they go, well, the military convenience or necessity, military necessity, I think is the concept that usually is emphasized to understand, for example, massacres in the Eastern Front. The military leaders believed that it was necessary to exterminate any potential resistor because of the objective of asserting the control of territory. That happens at the beginning. Well, later this evolves, this motivation evolves, and they say, well, actually we can get rid forever of all these groups holding that Marxist ideology, taking advantage of the same context. So these motivations initially are strategic, they become more, they change over time. But yeah, one thing that usually hasn't been very much discussed by historians is this strategic context for to understand the origins of exterminatory policy.
I've got a lot more, but I'll...
Other questions? Oh, we have some people online, so I might go to them first and then come back to the room. Julie.
Good morning, everyone. I really enjoyed this paper because I thought you worked really strongly with some visual evidence and some statistical evidence when, as you say, there's not a lot of evidence in documents that's telling you, well, this is why the violence occurred. But the reason I put my hand up just right then was as a follow-up to Philip's second question. So as you were speaking, it seemed to me the one absence in everything you're talking about is that colonization is generally about land. I know I'm oversimplifying, but I'm going somewhere. And I can see how strongly you're arguing that there's colonial practices being turned from colonial expansion onto the Spanish people, and that there is the ideological battle between the nationalists and the Republicans, which is around the idea of how to order society and perhaps also how to order land ownership. And so there's the class issues and also the land ownership issues. And I'm thinking about Patrick Wolf's work, his argument about the logic of elimination, which is we usually think of in terms of settler colonialism, of course. But when you're talking about the motivation for such relentless violence, I wonder if you see that perhaps it's possible that that the idea of who gets to control the land and the way it's distributed is at the core of this, and that the viciousness of the violence comes from a sense of frustration that Spain can't expand its borders, or it's not having colonial success. So it sort of starts. Okay, this is not quite an historical way of putting it necessarily. This is not quite my research area, but Spain starts to eat itself. Is sort of what I hear you describing. So, is it possible that land has a role in what it is that is the motivation here?
Indeed, yeah. The question of land reform, for example, was a crucial issue during the period of the Second Republic, and well, when the Popular Front was in power, well, it was not the Popular Front in power. Anyway, there is this project of land reform that is very threatening to landowners, to big landowners, and that coincides with the support of those social groups to the project of a violent reaction, coup d'etat against the Second Republic. One can see even in different regions, in those regions of Spain where there had been more intense struggles between peasants without land and big landowners, that is translating into a higher number of killings by the rebels of these leaders of well, trade unions in rural areas, etc. One can see that very clearly, and yeah, there is, yeah, historians have usually emphasized that aspect as one of the key causes of the violence. The revolutionary movements at the beginning of the war also go through a revolution in, for example, in Aragon, where they communalize the land, etc. So that's a crucial aspect. But also in terms of land and territory, there is also in the mentality of the rebel leaders this idea that the control of the land and the territory was strategically extremely important. That's how they had learned to conduct war in Morocco in a colonial context, and that's how they try to securitize the territory they are conquering. That's very specific about Franco, who wanted to cleanse all that territory that they are occupying. That means to exterminate those working class movements in the countryside and in rural areas. So yeah, those connections are important. Thanks.
Okay, because we're coming close to the end of the time, because there's another meeting in this room, I'll go back to the online, and then those who are in the room can have further conversation over coffee afterwards. Umid.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be as brief as possible. I really enjoy your presentation too. Thank you so much. It's quite interesting. I was wondering to what extent the society support all these persecution, genocidal policies, and repression, and so forth. I mean, how was it reflected at the grassroots level, at the societal level, and what kind of sections of society from different classes support or consent this process, if it existed, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important topic, and in fact, there is a lot of research on that. I even wrote a whole book about the support of different sectors of society to the coup d'etat and to the rebels in the city of Zaragoza in particular. And there is, well, a clear class dimension to that support. It is the, landowners or urban property owners, or in classic terms, the bourgeoisie, that tends to support with money, with volunteering also to the armies of the rebels, and other kinds of support. That happens very clearly. But regarding the violence specifically, that's more difficult to investigate, also because very quickly the rebels kept all that repressive process in secret, right? So it was not directly visible the extent